Hi everyone, it's Denise with Wondubar Crafts. Today I am starting a new series on quilting. I'm going to be showing you guys how to do this crazy stairway to nowhere wall hanging. You can download this for free for a limited time. I think I'm going to have it available till like the end of February, but I will leave a link below in the description block so that you can go and download it from Flickr for free. And hopefully you guys will give it a go, give it an attempt. And for those of you who have more experience quilting, it'll be a nice, small, short project that you can do, have a little fun with it. I chose the colors I did because my office is predominantly pink. I have a little bit of sage in there, so I kind of wanted to pull out a little more sage. So that's why I chose the colors I did. I purchased this fabric from Hobby Lobby, but of course you can choose to do any color scheme that you want. You can go crazy with it and just have every single one different color, or you can coordinate it with, whatever your favorite color is, right? So the wall hanging should come out to be about 20.5 by 20.5, which is about window pane sized. So it's fairly small and very simple to do. It looks intricate, but I promise you it's very, very simple. Just 3-strip block, okay? And all it is it's moving the block to in a different direction to give that different pattern. So as you see here, we've got 4 blocks that will make one big block, and we'll have 4 of those sewn together, and it will create a staircase illusion on there. So you can choose different fabrics for your borders, for your binding, for your backing. I chose 4 different ones. One is separate for my backing, and then 3 for my actual quilt front. All right, so let's go ahead and get started on this. I'm so excited. I did do a separate video that talks about some of what's in the front of this pattern. It's a 20-page pattern, and I did do it in a PDF format so that you can download it and print it, or you can upload it on your iPad or your tablet and have it sitting right there next to your machine to follow along if you wanted to. In the back, the last couple pages is a bonus I added in there on how to add a hanging sleeve if you want to hang it with a dowel. You don't have to if you don't want to, but by the time you finish this pattern, reading these instructions and having the pictures in there as a guide should be fairly simple for you to do. I don't do them for wall hangings. I pin mine with straight pins. But this other video does talk about some of the basics. It talks about fabric grains, your stitched lengths and your seam allowances and ironing, and also talks about some of the basic materials you're going to need to quilt, to do your cutting and your sewing and all that. I did do this pattern with as many picture illustrations as possible, because if you're like me, I like to see it. I like to read it and then see it so that I understand it. If you are not a picture kind of person, there's good instructions on how to piece it together. If you have experience, this is going to be a whiz for you. If not, I tried to keep it very simple. When I started, I did small blocks and little square blocks, and I don't think it was the blocks weren't big enough to, or the patches were not big enough to really give me a good feel for seam allowances, so I chose a rectangle. Because these are 4.5 inches, you're going to have plenty of space to be able to stitch it and take a look to see if you need to adjust your seam allowance or your sewing, or what you need to do to adjust that for the remainder of your piecing. So we're going to we're going to have 8-inch blocks. We're going to build 4 blocks but we're going to make 16 smaller ones to make those 4 blocks. Sew them all together and have a beautiful staircase pattern. In the instructions, I've given your yardages, and I also gave it in inches. The reason I did that is sometimes if you go to Walmart or Hobby Lobby, people understand quarter, half, 3/4, yard, 2 yard, yard and a half, whatever. But when you start getting into the more intricate fractions, it takes a minute for them to figure it out. So if you already have the inch length to tell them, I need a 1/6 of an inch, 6 inches, they'll know. Also in that other video, I do show you how to square your fabric to get all that selvage off so that it's nice and it lays nice and even, and you'll have nice smooth cutting. You shouldn't have any bubbling, which will give your, if it's not squared correctly when you cut, it could bubble it in or out depending on, you know, how it was folded. So I give you instructions on how to do that appropriately. I also show you how to lay your strips so that you can, you don't have to cut each strip 4.5 inches out 16 times. You can layer it and make 4 cuts for that. But I will talk a little bit about how to do it. I do use the AccuQuilt cutting system to cut out my blocks. I cut my strips for this one and then cut them down rotary with a rotary cutter to the 4.5 inch length, because they do not make a rectangle in that size. This is not a standard, and I did that on purpose so that you'll have practice on rotary cutting. By all means, if you find that it's just too tedious for you, AccuQuilt does sell some really awesome dies, and I always purchase my stuff when it's on sale. So, and they always have great sales. So, but I will leave a link to AccuQuilt below. It is an affiliate link, and if you do use it, any monies that is made off of the AccuQuilt system, I do put 100% of that back into giveaways into my channel. So, you know, you guys help me out, I help you guys out, right? So, yardages, yay. So what I decided to do, and what I like to do, is I like to use little stickies. You can use the bigger ones, smaller ones, a piece of paper, pin it to there, however you want to do it. But mark your pieces so you don't get confused later. So my very first fabric, which is the lighter tan color, I mark it A. My second one is B. My third color is C. I then have my strips of borders, okay, pre-cut out, and I put borders, and then my binding, so I don't get confused with the strips. Although the color is, you know, is not the same, I shouldn't get confused, but it's just easier. Oh yeah, these are my borders, you know, and I can pick up and go with the pattern much easier. So also get yourself some coordinating fabric. I got some little light tan here. It's in all, you know, all but this color. The polka dots are an off-white color, so I think it coordinates very well. And then of course once you cut your pieces, I do give instructions in that video. I did link it earlier if you didn't go back and catch it. When I talked about having this other video, I linked it up at the top. So, and I did this video separately so that you didn't have to keep hunting and pecking between videos in the future on how to do that if you forgot how to square. Because when you first begin, even I sometimes have to remember, oh yeah, I've got to shift it over this way and get it all nice and square, and that's probably why I'm not cutting straight. But a good square, if you get your fabric good and squared, your pieces will come out really nice and cut very well. So we're going to need also a rotary cutter, the mat, and some small squaring squares to square down if we need to. And so let's talk about our yardages. So from fabric A, we're going to need to cut 16 patches. Now I call these patches and not blocks because I don't want you to get confused with these blocks that we're building. So we're going to cut patches, sew those patches together to make a block. All right. You're going to need a 1/6 of a yard, which is 6 inches. There's an asterisk there because I also am using the same color for my binding. You do not have to do that, but just make sure that you get the yardage appropriate for that if you choose to change the binding color to a different color. And down here, I've given the total yardage. So for my cream and tan, I need 6 inches, 1/6 of a yard. I need 9 inches for my binding, which is a 1/4 yard. I need 1/2 yard total. And I'm asking that you get a little bit larger for squaring reasons. I have literally bought fabric and had 3 or 4 inches off on the cut from the bolt to square it off. And when you're trying to do a certain project and, oh, I need a 1/2 yard, and you buy, oh, let me get 3/4 of a yard, and then almost all of it's gone from squaring, it's frustrating because then you don't have enough. So give yourself a little wiggle room. The floral and paisley, which is my block B, I need to cut 16 patches, 1/6 of a yard, 6 inches, and I'm also going to need 2 large strip patches, also 1/6 of a yard, so I'm going to need a total of 12 inches, but I say 1/3 of a yard, okay, should be sufficient for that. And then my third, which is, I'm going to, my patch C fabric, 16 patches, 1/6 of a yard, 6 inches. We've already talked about the borders and the binding, okay? And you're going to make strips with these, and then the instructions in the next page will explain how to cut them down. I'm going to need, at least for my backing, which is this big piece here, I've already got it pre-cut, at least a 23 by 23 inch. So if you were, you cannot use a fat quarter. It will not, even though it's 18 by 20, you're going to be short. So I would suggest that you buy at least 23, 24 inches, and then square it off and cut it down for that. And a lot of people don't, they just use plain muslin on the back. Or you can use just some scrap fabric. Heck, you can even piece a couple pieces together to get it to a 23 by 23. It's totally up to you. Batting, the same thing. We talk about all these things in that other video, different types of batting, but you are going to need to cut yourself a piece that's 23 by 23. Okay, so those are already pre-cut for me. And so, doing the rotary cutting. This is the block we're going to make, and we're going to make 4 of those, but we're going to need to make 16 of these smaller blocks, as you can see, A, B, and C, A, B, and C. Turn them in different directions to get this to this block. So, here is my fabric strip that I have cut. I've cut it, I'm going to cut it, both A and C are the same size, so you're going to cut your strips at 1.5 inches wide, and then lay your strips out, and then cut 4.5 inches. If you cut 2 strips from each of those, for each that are 1.5 inches, 2, 4, yes, and you stack them because they're double length. So let me see if I can give you, here's my binding, right? Here's 1 strip. It's cut, it's doubled over. I'm going to lay it out and even it and square it, just like I showed on the other video. And then I can stack another one on top and square it off, even it out, cut off my selvage, and then I can cut 16 patches, because you're going to have 4 strips when you cut, because it's stacked. 4 layers. You'll cut it at 4.5, at the 9, at the 13.5, and then at the 18, I believe, right? 13, yes, 18. So that gives you 16 pieces. So you'll cut 2 strips of each of your fabrics and lay them out. I would suggest that you not stack more than 2 if you're a beginner at rotary cutting. Okay, if you're nervous about it, you can cut them individually, doubled over in the strip if you so choose. Then your B fabric, you will cut your strips 2.5 inches in width, doing the same thing, 2 strips, lay them out, and then cut them in 4.5, 9, 13.5, and 18. Okay, and that will give you 16 strips. Your horizontal borders, you're going to cut 2 long strips that are also 2.5 inches. Okay, and then you're going to take 1 strip, and because it's doubled over, cut off your selvage, cut it at 20.5 inches, then lay out your second strip and cut it at 16.5 inches, because you've got 2 different sizes. So don't cut all 4 at 16.5. You're going to be short and be cutting more fabric. Okay, and this is your vertical border. That's 16.5. Your binding, you're going to need to make 3 strips that are 2 inches in width. Okay, and they should be at least, you're going to have extra. If you've got, I say 40 inches, that's enough to do the binding. You can cut them down to a 40 inch. So when you lay that strip out, cut off to the 20 inch mark, and then you'll have a 40 inch. What I typically do is I just cut the 3 strips, and then I'll cut off the selvage and just go from there. I will always have extra binding, which is okay because I can always cut it off, and that excess I'll use for a backing tag for signing, or I put it back in my scrap bin for later. I also added instructions on what dies you would need if you use the AccuQuilt cutting for this. I wasn't going to add it, but I decided to go ahead and add it anyways. And it does talk about how many strips and then how to cut it down with the rotary cutter for that. So you will use all the strip dies for that. But they are all listed on there if you so choose to use it. But if you do have an AccuQuilt cutting system, I would suggest that you buy strip dies, because you can do, some of them do, depending on the width. I have ones that will cut 5 strips at a time, which is awesome for binding a huge quilt, or doing inner borders or what have you. So it's well worth the investment. Now, when we construct this, so now is a good time to pause the video and go ahead and, if you haven't already done so, watch the other video to square off your fabric and do your rotary cutting, and then come back, and then we'll talk about constructing our quilt block pieces. Okay, so hopefully you have all your pieces cut out and they're all stripped and they're all marked and everything is ready to go. And we're going to go through the instructions. So it does say that the following diagrams is in when I'm building the block and you're looking at piecing your pieces together. How I did it was, your shaded is the right side of the fabric, which is how your fabric looks pieced up with the pattern up, and the wrong side of the fabric, which is the back side. Okay, so when you're looking at the diagrams, you'll see you're going to put like a piece, the block that's completed wrong side up, but the right sides will be together on top of the other block. Okay, so let me go ahead and move everything. What I would suggest is move all your pieces marked up over by your machine, set them out so you can see what you're doing. So let's go ahead and move on over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to show you how to start piecing these pieces together. All right, so over at the machine, and in the other video, I did talk about the different feet that you can use. Just use your standard, if you have one that has an opening here, you're going to want to use that, because most of them will have some markings on there, because we want to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you notice on my machine, I have a red line and a green line. My machine has a projector so that I can effectively piece that at a 1/4 inch. In the other video, I also give you some other tips. An inexpensive way is to get a magnet piece, okay, which I will put on here so that you guys can see it in use. Okay, and it just attaches to my plate, and I am just going to align that to the 1/4 inch marking right there. All right, And what this is, and pull it back, so my foot, let me put my foot down, so that my fabric can bump up against this edge right here, and then it'll feed to the machine. If you don't have anything like this, don't stress. Use a piece of tape. Just measure, take your foot off. So you would just take your foot off and measure from where put your needle in the down position and measure out a 1/4 inch from there, and then lay a piece of tape down, okay? Or you can get, there's different things on Amazon that you can get. Just look for a guide, like a magnetic guide or a sewing guide that's, that you can lay out on there. It's going to make piecing so much easier and a lot more accurate, all right? But like I said, this one is a very inexpensive. I paid like $3 for it, and it's magnetic, and it just comes out off the plate, no problem. So let me pull this back up. This foot has a 1/4 inch guide on it as well. So I'm giving myself kind of, you don't have to use something like this, but it does give me some added security, if you will, that my pieces will be at least a 1/4 inch. So we are going to start by sewing patches A to patches B. Okay, so if you are using directional fabric, you want to make sure that your patch B is right side up and that it's in the direction in the opposite direction, because your A block, if you look on page 8 of the instructions, when you iron it, your A block will be, you want it on, so this is already in the direction that I need it. So it has to go, it's going to be on the left side. So if I sewed it on this side, then my directional piece is going to be upside down, and we don't want that. So I'm going to turn it upside down, and then I'm going to turn my A block wrong side up and over the top. And then I'm just going to square it. You can pin these if you so choose, if you feel like it's going to set better. I find that if I just take my time, I really don't need to do any of that because these are smaller pieces. So now I hope that you can see, I don't know if you can, but here's my line. That is where I know my needle should be going through. And then I have my guide plate. Let me even it out a little bit. And then I have a guide here. So I'm just going to put the fabric just enough so that the dogs, or the feed dogs, pick up that fabric and start going through. Set your machine, and there is instructions in the handout there, or in the directions. If you use metric, like mine uses both metric and standard, set it at a 3 for metric, or 16 stitches per inch on your machine. So if you use inches on yours, this is a nice tighter stitch, and it'll hold your pieces so much better, especially in the wash. So we're just going to sew it. I'm just take my time and sew all the way down. Now with this, we will do a chain effect, but with this first piece, I'm going to take it off and show you. If you've never quilted before, this is something that you may want to try and do. So let me grab my little ruler here, and I just want to make sure that when my guide is set, and you can do this on a practice piece, you don't have to do it on your other. I want to make sure that I have got a 1/4 inch from the top, the middle, and the bottom, and I'm looking good. So I've got a good stitch there. Everything is set up pretty good. So now I'm ready to go. So I'm just going to set that piece on, and then we're going to chain where we are going to do, okay, that's my top, that's my bottom. We're going to chain piece all these together, and then iron, snip them and iron them. So like I said, I'm just squaring my corners and the tops to make sure Just gonna slide it over, make sure everything's square, do the same thing, and just stitch. I'm thinking it might be easier for you guys if you can see. I don't know if you can see that little green line. That's where I want to line up my fabric. If you're going to use a piece of tape just on that edge. Just take your time. I will say, sometimes you want to get the project done because you want to get it done. But if you take your time, and you will amaze yourself at what you're capable of doing. So now I've stitched to the end. I'm going to give 1 or 2 stitches past the fabric, and then I'm going to, okay, so I think that is my up. I want to turn it upside down. This fabric is non-directional. It can go either way, so I don't have to worry about it. Once again, line my pieces up. Just feed it under there. You don't have to, you can lift if you want, so that it picks up, and just slowly stitch those pieces together. And periodically you may want to stop and just check some pieces that you've already sewn. Just make sure that you're still sewing at that 1/4 inch allowance. You know, it could be off by just a millimeter, and that's okay. That little scant bit is going to be okay. What you don't want to do is be off by like 1/8 of an inch or more, getting you more seam allowance or less, because it will distort your block. So if that happens, make sure you have your seam ripper and just take it apart, relay it down, and sew it. I will tell you, it's much easier to do that before you iron them, because if you iron it and it's not, you're going to have to re-iron all those pieces again, or those pieces back out, and then relay them in piece up. So let's do one more piece here. Okay, we're going to turn it upside down. Square off. I hope you guys can see this. I probably should I'll try and fix my angle for the next piece there. Okay, so that my edges are, it's just very hard in front of this machine, because I want to try and get the sewing machine as much as possible. So I'll lift my foot a little bit, just tuck it under there, right at the guide, and let it pick it up and start sewing. So now what you're going to do is you're going to sew all your A pieces, all 16 pieces together, so that you have your A sewn to B, just like in the instructions. So I'll flip over to the other camera and show you here, just a second. Okay, over. Okay, so let's see, where are we at? Yeah. So here we've shown, here's your B fabric. Of course, remember, if it's directional, it needs to be upside down. We're going to place our A wrong side up to our B right side up. And then once we iron it and open it, that's what it should look like. Okay? All right, so go ahead and pause and finish doing your first 16 pieces, or your first 16 patches, sewing A to B. Okay? And then come back and we'll start on our next patch that needs to get sewn on. Okay, so what I have done is, here's that one piece we used to measure, and I have 15 more pieces all sewn together. So what I'm going to do is take this over to the ironing board, and I am going to iron. You can keep them in the chain link to iron them if it's easier for you. Me personally, I like to snip my threads first and then just stack them and iron them one at a time. So if I need to focus on just one, I'm not trying to maneuver all these pieces together. So when I iron it, remember I had it upside down, so I'm going to turn it right side so that my A block is now on my left side, but I am going to iron it like this so that my seam is facing my darker fabric like that. So we take it over to the ironing board, iron them out, and show you what yours should look like. Okay, so I sewed all my pieces and I got them all ironed out, and then my last two pieces I noticed were off. So this is a good opportunity to show you what happens if you rush, which apparently I did with the last two pieces to get it done, and what to do if when you iron them and you notice, or you noticed before, how to fix it. Okay, so if you notice with this, when I ironed it out, I am off in my how I measured it by 1/8 of an inch. And I don't want that, because what's going to happen is when I go to attach another piece, here it's my stitch line is 1/4 inch is only going to give me 1/8 of an inch. It's not very strong. Okay, and over time, especially on bigger quilts, if you wash them frequently, eventually that stitch will just start to pull, and then you're going to end up with a hole in your quilt, and you don't want that, right? So what I had to do with the other one was take it apart and remeasure. I always remeasure my pieces, because when you rotary cut, you from time to time will make a mistake on your measurement. Okay, so what I want to do is measure, that is, and make sure that my pieces are in fact, before I have to take it all apart, I may just have to cut another piece, right? So why go through all that if it's too short? So this is 4.5 and this is 4.5. So I know my pieces are cut correctly. So what I did was, when I pieced it together, I laid it, it shifted, or I shifted it when I was sewing, because as your dog feeds pick up, your feed dogs, it's picking up the bottom fabric, and if you don't have a good tight control on it, it can shift your fabric. That's why I say sew slow. It's well worth it, so you don't end up doing this. So I've already repieced the other one and ironed it back out and fixed it. And I want all my pieces to align up. It's going to make it so much easier. It's like a puzzle, right? You want those pieces to just pop in there as easily as possible. So I'm going to take my seam and I'm just going to carefully pull out that. I ran it through the actual seam to break apart the threading, and then I'm just going to carefully pull it apart. I don't want to rip it apart, because your patches are small, and they will, when you start to work with them, the edges will start to fray a little bit. See, like that. So you don't want to, you're trying not to make your quilt patches smaller, so just be careful with it. And if it seems like, oh my gosh, that would be so tedious, before you start, take some scrap pieces of paper and practice your seam allowances and where you sew and what is comfortable at what speed. There are quilters that can just zoom it out. They've done them, forever and ever and ever. My thing is, I haven't done it in a long while, and I have a newer machine, so I have to get used to where, I need to make sure that I guide it through. So this gives you an opportunity to learn your machine and also to perfect your piecing ability. So let me go ahead and resew this, re-iron it, and I'll show you what the blocks look like, or what yours should look like after you're done piecing and ironing them. Okay, so I resewed it, and now my block is much more even. So now you should have 16 of these pieces sewn. You will need to make sure that your pieces go back in the direction that they were. Okay, so now your pieces should look like this, where A and B meet right side up. So now what we're going to do is we're going to attach C to A and B. All right, so A and B is on the right side up, and C will be the wrong side. So your right sides are together, and you'll see the wrong side up. And then we're going to do the same thing we did with A with C. Okay, so let's move back over to the sewing machine, and we will go ahead and sew that C block on there. Or patch, I should say. I'm sorry. I keep calling it a block, but it is a patch. So we're going to sew C patch to the AB patch. All right, so I pulled the camera out just a little bit, so it gives me a little more room here to show you guys how I'm piecing these together. So now, if you noticed on the back, we ironed our seam allowance over to the darker side here. See if we can see it. Okay. And then now what we're going to do is we're going to put our C fabrics patches onto A and B. So with the right sides together, which means my C fabric, you should see the wrong side up, onto the right side of the B block, we're going to do the same thing. Let me just adjust this camera, if you don't mind, a little bit here so that you can get a better picture. Okay, so once again, we're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we can stop and check our seams. We'll do this first one just to make sure that we didn't shift anything when we got up from the machine. Always a good idea. Okay, so we're going to check the seam allowance on that one. Sorry, I had to reach across and get my ruler here. So there's a 1/4 inch, there's a 1/4 inch, and there is a 1/4 inch. Okay, so we got a little piece of thread here hanging off. I'm going to pull that off, and we're good to go. We got 15 more to do, so let me do a couple more with you. So right side up, A and B, and wrong side up on our C patch. Get it aligned up there, and get to sewing. It may seem like it's a little tedious to have to do it going slow, but when you start seeing your blocks pieced together so much smoother, and then your pieces they all align up, and your border, and then you get your backing and batting on it, and then you're just going to be amazed at what you've done. You're going to be like, oh my gosh, it was so well worth it. So once again, my piece on there, got it all squared up, feed it into the machine, and just keep chain linking them together. And I'm just lightly holding my fabric so that it doesn't shift too much. All right, and 1, 2, and I'm ready to do the next one. So get all 16 of your patches sewn together, and we'll come back. Then I'm going to show you that again, show you where to iron your seam allowance. All right, so I now have all my 16 pieces, or actually 15 here and my one over here, all chain linked together. I'm going to snip them, and then I'm going to iron. And because this fabric is a little bit darker than my tan, I can just iron my seam allowance so that it meets to my block C. So it will look like this, so that the seam allowance will all go in one direction. All right, so go ahead and pause the video and snip all your pieces and get them ironed, and then we'll come back and take a look at what we need to do next. All right, so after ironing, I set them out and I take a look at each of my blocks. This is how it should look. Here's your A, B, and C. All right, and then on the back, all the seam allowances are pressed in the same direction. So I went through and I always look at my edges. Some of them are off on this stack, and then some are lined up very well, like this one on this stack, and it happens to be half and half, which tells me that when I cut my first two strips with my rotary, I cut them straight, and then I may have been off by a small fraction. So now what I want to do is I want to try and square them up. Now, here's what's important about squaring. When you go to square, you're going to need to measure first before you do any cutting, because if your square should now be a 4.5 by 4.5 inch square. So if we take this and let's see, take our ruler, or you can take your squaring ruler. This should be 4.5 by 4.5. Okay, so I know that I don't need to mess with anything with this. Now if I go to measure this one, I notice that the top is sewn nice and one edge is longer when I sewed it on. So this tells me this is probably, it's 4.5 that way, and this one up here on this block is 4.5. There's 4.5. Sorry, trying to get it straightened here, and that's 4.5. So this is not a big deal, because this portion right here is only a 1/16 off. Okay, I'm not going to cut it. I'm not going to square it. I'm just going to leave it. It's such a small fraction. It's what they call a scant, and it's not going to make that big of a difference. So on that one, I can stack that. But I'm going to check all of them. Now, if you find that you've got one piece that is 4.5, and this one is a little larger than 4.5, you can go ahead and square it up. And I'm not going to cut anything yet because I haven't measured them all. But you want to square it up on your cutting mat so that you have a 4.5 inch. Make sure that your seam, that you have a grid line and that your seam is lined up and your edge is lined up as perfectly as possible, and then just trim off that little edge. Now, here's where a problem comes in. If this piece is 4.5 and this piece or another piece is now 4 and what is that on? Let's say it's 4 3/8. Okay, you've got a problem, because now you've cut a piece of fabric that's too short. You cannot square that down because that one piece is not going to fit up and bump up. So you will either A, need to recut these 3 pieces and resew them, or well, that's what you're going to have to do, plain and simple. But if it's too long, that's okay. It could have just been something that you did with the rotary cutter when you were cutting, because sometimes it does get confusing. Okay, if I put my rotary cutter, my ruler, do I put it on the edge, in the middle, or on the end? What I do is, whatever side, so if I line it up to the very edge of that line so that you can't see it underneath the ruler, it's just right there, that is what I'm going to do to cut on the other side. Okay, so that might, or I'm going to come to the end of that other so that you can see the full line on that one. So that way you're cutting that full piece and they're all cut the same. Okay. So with this one, it's the same thing. It's such a scant off. I'm not going to worry about cutting it. This one is just a little bit bigger, but I can go ahead and trim it and just show you guys how I'm going to square it. So my top edge is nice and aligned. I'm going to align it up to kind of like when you square your other fabric, right? And then I'm going to take my squaring ruler here, and I want to align my grid to my sew line and all the way to the edge here, so that I just have that small little piece there hanging out, because I don't want to cut it down anywhere else. It's straight there, and it might be off just by a little hair down here, but that's okay. But I do want to try and square that so that it is 4.5. And I'm just going to cut that one little sliver off. I mean, look how small it was. Literally, that's how much I was off. That isn't even an 1/8. It's probably more like a 16th. And I didn't have to square it if I didn't want to, but I just wanted to show you guys that that's how you can square those off. Now, if you're squaring this, when you turn your block, you're going to square here or here. Do not square here or here. If you have to square that because it's too long or too short, your seam allowance is off. So you're going to need to figure out which seam allowance is off, pull that one patch off, and re-sew it back on there. It does seem like it's tedious work, but like I said, your pieces, you want your pieces to align up the best that you possibly can. Okay, so that is good. And like I said, these are just a scant off, not by much at all. Okay, this one seems like it's a little bit more off on this one, so I'm going to square that, and it's probably not by much. Okay, I'm going to align my seam allowance there and all the way to the edge there. Like I said, it's just a little minute amount. Just a little minute amount. But I like, you don't have to be that nitpicky. See, that's it. But sometimes when you're looking at it, it looks like it's off. See, this one I've sewn. I can tell because it's off up there and off down here. So this one I'm going to set aside. I'm going to rip it out and I'm going to re-sew it. And let me tell you, you will make mistakes. Okay? And it's okay. Just take it apart and sew it again. Everyone makes them. Everyone can make them. You know, because you are dealing with fabric. It's just like sewing on your, an outfit, or even sewing on paper. You can make a small mistake. It happens. Don't beat yourself up over it. All right? Just fix it and move on. That's why I also, say buy a little bit of extra fabric. I would, if it says buy 1/6 of a yard, you can you could double it, but that's kind of excessive. If it says 6 inches, tell her 8 inches or 10 inches. Gives yourself a little bit of extra fabric. So if you have to cut another strip and cut a couple extra pieces, you've got it in the bag, right? So, okay, this one's off a little bit. And it looks like this one might be off as well on the top. So this is a seam allowance issue. So I'm not going to cut these two pieces. I'm going to redo, and then I will be ready to start piecing them out in different directions. So as soon as I get this done, we're going to come back. Now is probably a good time, if you've already sewn all your pieces out and ironed them and trimmed them up, to go ahead and take a pause, go get a cup of coffee, go have some lunch, stretch your legs, your eyes, and your brain to come back so that we can go ahead and start piecing these bigger patches into a bigger block. All right. So go ahead and take a pause, take a break, and we'll come back and start piecing all these together. Okay, so after looking at how long we've been on so far, I think now instead of taking a pause, obviously, you can pause it and do what you need to do, but now would be a good stopping point for this video. I will be uploading the second part of this video back to back, so you guys don't have to wait days between. But in the next video, we're going to move on and piece these pieces together in the different directions and sew them so that we can start building our blocks. So until next time, guys, plenty of hugs, loves, and blessings. Mwah. Thanks for joining me, guys, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye, guys.